Welcome to the Italian Renaissance podcast, where we discuss the culture and art of 15th and 16th century Italy. I'm your host, Lawrence Gianangeli. Andiamo avanti.
Renaissance people, welcome back to the Italian Renaissance podcast. And today we're going to tackle our final discussion of the cultural production in the court of Urbino. In our last conversation with the magnificent Professor Reynolds, we looked very closely at Quattrocento and painting and architecture under the patronage of Federico da Montefeltro, Duke of Urbino. I want to turn to the critical literary output of the Urbino court, particularly a work which is undoubtedly one of the most important texts of the Renaissance, Baldassare Castiglione's Il Cortegiano, known in English as the Book of the Courtier, which was published in 1528. However, before we get to Castiglione, I want to talk about the literary culture in Urbino leading up to Castiglione, namely one work by the artist and court writer Giovanni Santi. You may remember that Giovanni Santi is Raphael's father, his first master, and the man who ultimately placed Raphael in Perugino's workshop in Perugia. Santi's career unfolded in Urbino under the patronage networks surrounding the Montefeltro and the Della Rovere rulers, especially Duke Federico da Montefeltro and later Federico's son Guidobaldo, who is seen in the portrait we discussed last episode by Eustace von Gent. The Urbino court was renowned for its humanist culture, diplomatic activity, and artistic patronage, and Santi operated at its heart as a painter, mediator of court culture, and a chronicler of contemporary artistic achievement. He also operated as a court poet. The court environment fostered, let's call it a cosmopolitan taste, and close interactions with Florentine, Flemish, and other Italian artists, which influenced Santi's stylistic choice and his written work, the Cronaca rimata, or the rhymed chronicle. This work, composed in the 1480s, perhaps during the end of Federico da Montefeltro's reign, and certainly during the rise of Guidobaldo. It is a very lengthy history, and it's set to verse, terza rima, that is the same rhyme structure that Dante used. It details a great number of the feats and the battles of the various courts in northern Italy. It's very hefty, but just to name a few examples, we see Santi discuss Lorenzo the Magnificent's negotiations in Naples. We see histories of the Este and Ferrara, the Malatesta and Rimini, that is the enemy of the Montefeltro. We even see a history of the Ottoman Turks' conquest of Otranto, which occurred in 1480. But it also gives us very specific insight as to the cultural activities that were valued in the court of Urbino, because Santi names the 27 most influential artists of his day. So we can tell which artists, by the Urbino standard, are being historicized by modern scholarship, in the sense of who is being upheld and praised by modern scholarship and who was being upheld and praised in their own time. I'm going to read this terza rima translated into English, so it actually doesn't have the rhyme scheme, but this is what Giovanni Santi writes in the 1480s. In the splendid, noble art, so many have been famous in our century, they make any other age seem poor. At Bruges, the most praised were great Jan van Eyck and his pupil Rogier van der Weyden, with many others gifted with great excellence. In the art of painting and lofty mastery of coloring, they were so excellent, they many times surpassed reality itself. In Italy, then, in this present age, there were the worthy Gentile da Fabriano, Fra Giovanni Angelico of Fiesole, ardent for good, and in medals and painting Pisanello, Fra Filippo Lippi and Francesco Pesellino, Domenico called Veneziano, Masaccio, Andrea del Castagno, Paolo Uccello, Antonio and Piero Polaiolo, great draftsmen, Piero della Francesca, older than these, two young men like in fame and years, Leonardo da Vinci and Pietro Perugino, of Pieve, a divine painter, Ghirlandaio, the young Filippino Lippi, Sandro Botticelli, and from Cortona, Luca Signorelli, of rare talent and spirit. Then, going beyond the lovely land of Tuscany, there is Antonello da Messina, a famous man, Giovanni Bellini, whose praise spread far, and Gentile, his brother, Cosimo Tora, and his rival Ercole de Roberti, and many others I omit. Yet not Melozzo da Forlì, so dear to me, and in perspective so far advanced. Through this example, you guys should have recognized most of those artists. Through this example, we can see how writers of the early flourishing Urbino court connected their lords and patrons with the wider scope of art and cultural development throughout Renaissance Italy. As we always work to balance this concept of Florentine centrality, it should still be noted that 13 out of 27 of the listed artists are Florentine, and a couple of others trained in Florence. So that means that in the court of Urbino, we can safely suppose that Florence was indeed seen as a center of supreme painting, while Urbino itself can be considered as an essential center of courtly culture. Giovanni Santi, as a writer of the generation before Castiglione, which makes Castiglione of Raphael's generation, but the centering of Urbino as an apex of courtly culture survives in Santi's works. Castiglione was born in 1478 near Mantua, and Guidobaldo da Montefeltro became duke in 1482. So we see that Guidobaldo is a bit older than Castiglione. Castiglione's initial training was in the courts of Ludovico Sforza in Milan, where he worked as a courtier and a diplomat among the northern courts. If you recall from our history of Sforza Milan, the same French occupation that drove Leonardo da Vinci from Milan back to Florence is what moved Castiglione from Milan back to Mantua. However, he received a supreme humanistic education in the Sforza court. By 1504, after a diplomatic mission to Rome, whereupon Castiglione met Guidobaldo, he at last relocated to the court of Urbino, which he praised as the supreme court of Italy. We have to understand how interwoven these courts were, where Federico da Montefeltro was married to Battista Sforza, and his son Guidobaldo was married to Elisabetta Gonzaga, Elisabetta being one of the focal figures in Castiglione's book of the Courtier. This means that Castiglione arrived in Urbino at the age of around 26, having already served in the courts of Milan and Mantua. Being a classically trained humanist, at the behest of his friend and a fellow aristocrat, Alfonso Ariosto, Castiglione was challenged to compose a written work in which he would define what is the essence of the ideal courtier. We can see now how the courtly culture in Urbino was prevalent enough that it inspired what essentially became the handbook for aristocrats and nobility to follow that would instruct them on the ways of the courts and what behaviors were and were not in good taste. Now, what makes this a humanistic work? Recall that that Renaissance humanism is associated with the revival of Greek and Latin antiquity. In a letter which serves as the preface to the book accompanying a copy which was delivered to the Bishop of Viseu, Castiglione directly positions his text in line with the ancient tradition of creating a work which defines a particular ideal. I'm going to read from that letter, translated into English here. He says, "Others say that since it is so difficult and well nigh impossible to find a man as perfect as I wish the courtier to be, it was wasted effort to write of him, because it is useless to try to teach what cannot be learned. To such as these I answer that I am content to have erred with Plato, Xenophon, and Marcus Tullius, and just as, according to these authors, there is the idea of the perfect republic, the perfect king, and the perfect orator, so likewise there is that of the perfect courtier." This means Castiglione is using those ancient texts that he calls upon, Plato and Xenophon and Tullius, as models for his book of the Courtier, and in doing so, decides that the book should be in the form of a dialogue among the many courtiers and the nobility who attended and worked in the court of Urbino. Castiglione claims these were real conversations that he was not present for, but gathered the information and retells it as accurately as possible. This is rhetoric, of course. His setting and framework, however, should be taken as a historical record. There are 4 books, each representing a theme and a single evening of conversation among these courtiers, taking place over 4 nights. In Book 1 of the Book of the Courtier, Castiglione paints a very lively picture of how the court came together for philosophical discussions, namely under the supreme guidance of his much beloved Duchess Elisabetta Gonzaga. I'm going to read for you how he sets this up. From Book 1 of the Courtier, thus, all the hours of the day were given over to honorable and pleasant exercises, both of the body and of the mind, because owing to his infirmity, the Duke always retired to sleep very early after supper. Everyone usually repaired to the rooms of the Duchess Elisabetta Gonzaga at that hour, where also Signora Emilia Pia was also to be found, who, being gifted with such a lively wit and judgment, as you know, seemed the mistress of all, and all appeared to take on wisdom and worth from her. Here, then, gentle discussions and innocent pleasantries were heard, and on everyone's face a jocund gaiety could be seen depicted, so much so that this house could be called the very abode of joyfulness. Nor do I believe that the sweetness that is had from a beloved company was ever savored in any other place as it once was there. For, not to speak of the great honor it was for each of us to serve such a lord as I have described above, we all felt a supreme happiness arise within us wherever we came into the presence of the Duchess. And it seemed that this was a chain that bound all of us together in love, in such wise that never was there concord of will or cordial love between brothers greater than that which was there among us all. He's creating a very jovial, happy scenery that is within this court context, upon which the Duke goes to sleep. Guidobaldo suffered from gout. The Duke goes to sleep after dinner, and then once they're with the Duchess Elisabetta, everyone seems to just be happy and enjoy each other's company. Indeed, in the Ducal Palace in Urbino, the room that Castiglione is talking about is called the Sala delle Veglie, and it's the very room in which these courtiers retired for these evening conversations. And so, in this evening firelit jovial ambiance, the various nobles decide upon a game to debate one another on a large series of concepts and qualities, intentionally playing devil's advocate and even antagonizing one another, quite comically, to try to determine what attributes define the ideal courtier. This is the framework of the book. These real life living aristocrats, a lot are dead at this point, are the characters that make up the various points of the debate. Among the many nobles present, beyond the Duchess, we also have Giuliano de' Medici, who is the Duke of Nemours, not Lorenzo the Magnificent's brother, Count Ludovico of Canosa, Cesare Gonzaga, Pietro Bembo, and many, many others. I urge you all to read at least some of this book because the conversations are very enjoyable, they're very witty, sometimes long winded, but it gives us a glimpse at what court humor looks like, since they all seem to be courteously making fun of one another, or they use the example of someone not present to model bad court behavior. And it's quite tongue in cheek and it's quite sassy the way they do this. I'll demonstrate this playfulness in these conversations. I want to read another passage. In Book 1 still, while agreeing that an ideal courtier should have some physical prowess and athletic capability, Count Ludovico recalls a humorous example of poor character someone they all know has without naming him, but then he is rebutted by Cesare Gonzaga. I'm reading from Book 1 of the Courtier now. Count Ludovico says,
Stay with us. We'll be right back.
Renaissance people, do you want more content and maybe to help support this show? Join me on Patreon for exclusive podcast episodes, or if you want a visual experience, you can enroll in my Udemy course, which teaches the Florentine Renaissance and includes nearly 12 hours of art history lectures. You can also find podcast merch on our Etsy. You'll find links to all of these in the show notes. I want to thank you all sincerely for listening. Now, back to the show. As one of our friends the other day who, when he had had his thigh run through by a spear at Pisa, said that he thought a fly had stung him. And another who said he did not keep a mirror in his room because when he was angry, he became so fearful of countenance that if he were to see himself, he would frighten himself too much. He's talking about the boastfulness of these men. I was stabbed in the thigh, but I thought I got stung by a fly. Okay, I'm back to the book. Everyone laughed at this, but Messer Cesare Gonzaga added, "What are you laughing at? Do you not know that Alexander the Great, upon hearing that in the opinion of one philosopher there were countless other worlds, began to weep, and when asked why, replied, 'Because I have not yet conquered one,' as if he felt able to conquer them all? Does that not seem to you a great boast than that of the fly sting?" Then said the Count, "And Alexander was a greater man than the one who spoke so." So this is the idea. It's playing with a balance between the ancients and the courtier. You see, Alexander the Great is being mentioned as a way of giving ancient authority to a concept related to boasting. Then the two are balanced, since the ideal courtier is not an extreme. He's a harmony of characteristics. Probably the most important concept from book one was the very, very essential aspect in the Renaissance, not only in the court, but also in the production of art and in politics, is the term sprezzatura. We still use this term today. That is the art of making something that requires an enormous deal of effort and mastery look easy. My edition of the book translates that as nonchalance, but that's not exactly what sprezzatura means. Sprezzatura is a kind of grace that is mixed with skill and effort, and that is a prized attribute of the ideal courtier. It is making something that takes a great deal of effort look like it doesn't. That is sprezzatura. Finally, they seem to conclude with a statement on the use of language, where some suggest still the supremacy of the Tuscan way of speaking and writing, that is, the language of Petrarch and Boccaccio. There seems to be a favorable conclusion that the ideal courtier should be able to speak intelligibly, not using antiquated Tuscan words, but also combine the various ways of speaking among the many courts, borrowing where necessary, and even inventing new phrases. I should also note that in book one, since our focus is typically art history, what is said about the painters? And I'm gonna read here again. They're talking about the perfection of style, and it says, quote, "Moreover, different things give equal pleasure to our eyes, so that it is difficult for us to judge which things please them most. Consider that in painting, Leonardo da Vinci, Mantegna, Raphael, Michelangelo, and Giorgione da Castelfranco are most excellent, and yet they are all unlike one another in their works. So that in his own manner, no one of them appears to lack anything, since we recognize each to be perfect in his own style." So already, this is published in 1528, but it's written 1516, something like that. So what we're talking about is that Leonardo, Raphael, Mantegna, Michelangelo, and Giorgione is what Castiglione is praising as the perfect painters by this period. Giorgione would be dead. Who else is dead? Mantegna, I think. So this is sort of what brings us back to Giovanni Santi's list of 27 artists. This isn't 27, it's 5, but these are the 5. perfect painters that the book of the Courtier uses to draw parallels to different types of stylized perfection. So, if book one covered most of these physical traits of the courtier, both of body and speech and ability, then book two treats behavior and etiquette. They discuss how a courtier should depart a dishonorable prince and how he should act below his rank, and that an ideal courtier will have a good reputation in various courts across the lands. They also discuss humor and how a courtier should be clever. This is all, mind you, while the reader, us, are engaged in a text that is full of wit and humor. We should draw from that a centrality of wordplay and humor among courtiers during the Renaissance. Book three, at the insistence of the Duchess, turns to debates around the ideal court woman. It's a very interesting book. We see two opposing parties, one which believe women as inferior to men, and the other who promote women of the court as virtuous, equal, or even superior to men. So let me read you a short back and forth between Gaspare Pallavicino and Giuliano de' Medici, Giuliano de' Medici being the champion of women. Quote, Then Signore Gaspare said, laughing, Since you have granted letters and continence and magnanimity and temperance to women, I am quite surprised that you do not wish them to govern cities, make laws, lead armies, and let the men stay at home to cook or spin. The Magnifico replied, also laughing, Perhaps that would not be so bad either. Then he added, Don't you know that Plato, who certainly was no great friend to women, put them in charge of the city and gave all martial duties to the men? Don't you believe that many women could be found who would know how to govern cities and armies as well as men do? But I have not given them these duties because I am fashioning a court lady, not a queen. So indeed, Giuliano sounds quite in favor of this equal view of the abilities between men and women. And in another heated rebuttal, he says, and I'm reading again, the Magnifico Giuliano replied immediately, The poor creatures do not desire to be men in order to become more perfect, but in order to gain freedom and to escape that rule over them which man has arrogated to himself by his own authority. But woman does not receive her being from man. On the contrary, even as she is perfected by him, she also perfects him. Hence, they come together in procreation, which neither of them can effect without the other. So Giuliano is really the champion of somewhat a type of Renaissance gender equality. Meanwhile, his opposition continues to belittle women, and the Duchess doesn't seem to like that very much. It ultimately becomes a debate of extremes, though, upon which the conversation is concluded to return to the discussion of the courtier for the fourth and final night. The final book, Book 4, discusses mainly the relationship of the courtier and the princes they serve, which the courtier is meant to be able to advise the prince in all manners of virtue. It concludes with a conversation about divine love, and that the courtier should look to an ideal kind of love, the love of beauty itself, and to use love to transcend spiritually towards a more perfect being. And this idea is very similar to the idea flourishing in the art and literary worlds, is the idea that concludes the book of the courtier, the ascension of divine love. By the time Castiglione published this work, most of the courtiers in the dialogues were already dead. The draft was praised and distributed by the very famous noblewoman Vittoria Colonna of Rome, upon which Castiglione published the final work with his edits in 1528 through the Aldine press. That is the most significant and important printing press in Italy, printing now, guys, which begun in 1494 by the very important printer Aldus Manutius in Venice. During this period, Castiglione was serving as a courtier in Spain on the orders of Pope Clement VII in 1524, serving also the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, who was at the time in Spain. By 1527, Emperor Charles V had sacked Rome, and so Castiglione's reputation with the Pope and with Rome was somewhat ruptured, and he did effectively try to repair that rupture. Castiglione retired to Toledo, where he died of the plague in 1529, the year following the printing of his book of the Courtier, which was an immediate success. By 1561, it had already received its first English translation, and by that point was an international success throughout the courts of Europe as an etiquette manual for how to behave in the court. And for us today, it is a timeless literary classic that provides the most detailed look at court life in Renaissance Italy, specifically the prized court of Urbino. Renaissance people, thank you for tuning in. I hope you enjoyed this look at the literary world in Urbino, a little bit of a breath of fresh air away from our typical conversations about the art and art history. That superb Renaissance court of Urbino, from now which we must depart. Thank you so much for tuning in, and until next time, arrivederci.